Sarah Martinez stepped out of her old Honda Civic and looked at the shooting range building in front of her. The paint was chipped and the sign read Eagle Eye Shooting Range in faded letters. She had driven 40 minutes from downtown to get here, hoping to find a quiet place where she could practice without drawing attention to herself. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few pickup trucks and motorcycles. Sarah adjusted her simple black baseball cap and walked toward the entrance. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a plain gray hoodie. Nothing about her appearance suggested she had any special skills or training. Inside the range, the smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Behind the counter stood a large man with a beard and tattoos covering his arms. His name tag read, Buck. He looked up from his magazine and studied Sarah with skeptical eyes. "First time here?" Buck asked, not bothering to hide his doubt about her abilities. "Yes," Sarah replied softly. "I'd like to rent a lane for an hour." Buck slid a clipboard across the counter. "You'll need to fill this out." "Have you ever fired a gun before?" Sarah nodded as she took the pen. "A few times. Well, safety first around here. We don't want any accidents." Buck's tone suggested he thought she might be more dangerous to herself than to any target. As Sarah filled out the paperwork, she heard loud voices coming from the range area. Through the thick glass window, she could see 3 men in their 30s standing around Lane 5. They wore military-style clothing and expensive gear. One of them had a collection of different pistols laid out on the bench like he was showing off his arsenal. "That's Marcus and his crew," Buck explained, following her gaze. "They come in here every weekend. Marcus was in the army for a few years." "Real good shot." Sarah handed back the completed forms. "I'll take lane 7, please." Buck processed her payment and handed her safety glasses and ear protection. "What kind of weapon you want to rent?" "Do you have a Glock 19? She asked. Buck raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, we do. Most beginners start with something smaller, though." "The Glock will be fine," Sarah said calmly. Buck shrugged and retrieved the pistol from the display case. He loaded a magazine and gave her a quick safety briefing, speaking slowly as if she might not understand. Sarah listened politely, even though she could have recited the rules in her sleep. When she entered the range, the 3 men at lane 5 were in the middle of what seemed like a competition. Marcus was firing at a target 25 yards away, and his shots were grouped reasonably well in the center area. "Not bad for a weekend warrior," one of his friends called out as Marcus set down his pistol. "Weekend warrior?" Marcus laughed. "I was deployed twice, man. This is muscle memory." Sarah quietly set up at lane 7, 2 lanes away from the group. She clipped a target to the line and sent it out to 15 yards. As she loaded her magazine, she could feel the 3 men watching her. "Look what we got here," one of them said loud enough for her to hear. "Little lady thinks she can shoot." Marcus turned to look at Sarah. "Hey there, miss. You sure you're in the right place? This isn't exactly a beginner-friendly range." Sarah looked up from loading her magazine. "I'll be fine, thank you." "No offense, but you look like you've never held a gun before," Marcus continued. "Maybe you should start with the 22 range down the street." His friends chuckled, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she checked her weapon. She had dealt with this kind of attitude many times before, and she had learned that the best response was usually no response at all. "Tell you what," Marcus said, walking closer to her lane. "How about we make this interesting? $20 says you can't hit the target more than half the time from there." Sarah looked at him calmly. "I'm just here to practice. Come on, don't be shy. Everyone needs a little friendly competition." Marcus was clearly enjoying himself, and his friends were egging him on. "She's probably afraid she'll embarrass herself," one of them added. Sarah took a deep breath and positioned herself at the firing line. She raised the Glock, lined up her sights, and fired her first shot. The sound echoed through the range, and she immediately knew where the bullet had hit without looking at the target. "Ouch," Marcus said, looking at the target through his binoculars. "That's way off to the right, sweetheart. Maybe you should grip it tighter." Sarah didn't respond. She fired again and then again, working through her magazine with steady, measured shots. Each time she pulled the trigger, her stance remained perfectly consistent, her breathing controlled. When she finished the magazine, Marcus was already laughing. "Well, that was something. You want to bring that target back and see how you did?" Sarah pressed the button to retrieve her target. As it came back down the line, the 3 men gathered around to look at her results. Their laughter died away as they saw the tight group of holes clustered in the center of the bullseye. "Holy shit," one of them whispered. Marcus stared at the target in disbelief. That's actually pretty good for a beginner. Sarah ejected the empty magazine and began reloading. I'd like to continue practicing now if you don't mind. The three men stepped back, but they didn't return to their own lane. Instead, they watched as Sarah sent a fresh target out to 25 yards. This time, she took a moment longer to set up her stance, rolling her shoulders slightly and adjusting her grip. 25 yards is a lot harder, Marcus said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. That's expert-level distance. Sarah raised the pistol again and began firing. Her shots came in a steady rhythm, each one carefully aimed and controlled. The brass casings ejected in a neat pile to her right, and her feet never moved from their position. When she finished, she brought the target back once more. This time, all 10 shots were clustered in a group smaller than a golf ball, centered perfectly in the 10 ring. The range fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Marcus and his friends stared at the target, then at Sarah, then back at the target. Okay, Marcus said slowly. That was not beginner's luck. Sarah set down her pistol and turned to face him. Her expression was calm and serious, and for the first time, Marcus noticed something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. There was a confidence there, a steadiness that spoke of experience far beyond what her appearance suggested. You're right, Sarah said quietly. It wasn't. Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he stared at the target. The group of bullet holes was tighter than anything he had ever achieved, even on his best days. His friends Tony and Rick stood beside him in stunned silence, their earlier jokes completely forgotten. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Marcus asked, his voice lacking the cocky tone it had carried just minutes before. Sarah began packing up her gear methodically. Here and there, she said without looking up. Come on, Tony interjected, finding his voice again. Nobody shoots like that without serious training. Are you a cop or something? Sarah shook her head as she secured her ear protection in her bag. No, I'm not a police officer. Rick stepped closer, his eyes narrow with suspicion. Then what? You some kind of competition shooter? Because that grouping was professional level. I just practice a lot, Sarah replied, her tone remaining calm and measured. Marcus wasn't buying it. He had spent 4 years in the Army, including a deployment in Afghanistan, and he knew what kind of training produced that level of accuracy. Regular practice at a civilian range didn't create shooters who could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 25 yards. Look, lady, Marcus said, crossing his arms. I've been around guns my whole life. My dad was a Marine, I was Army, and I've seen plenty of good shooters. What you just did wasn't just good. That was Special Forces level precision. Sarah finished zipping up her range bag and slung it over her shoulder. I really should be going. Wait, Rick called out as she started walking toward the exit. At least tell us your name. Sarah paused at the door to the range. Sarah what? Marcus pressed. Just Sarah. She pushed through the door and walked back toward the front counter. Buck looked up from his magazine as Sarah approached. The shooting had stopped in the range and he could see the 3 men through the window, still clustered around lane 7, examining something. How'd it go? Buck asked, taking back the rental pistol. Fine, thank you. Sarah handed over the safety equipment and headed for the exit. Hey, wait a minute, Buck called after her. Marcus and his boys look like they've seen a ghost. What happened in there? Sarah turned back with a slight smile. They learned something new today. As the door closed behind her, Buck shook his head and chuckled. He had been running this range for 15 years, and he had seen all types of shooters. Something told him that Sarah wasn't just any regular customer. Back in the range, Marcus was taking photos of the target with his phone. Guys, this is insane. Look at this grouping. I mean, really look at it. Tony nodded, still processing what he had witnessed. She made it look so easy, like she wasn't even trying. That's what bothers me, Marcus said. When I shoot my best groups, I'm concentrating hard, holding my breath, really focusing. She just stood there and fired like she was plinking cans in her backyard. Rick picked up one of the spent brass casings from Sarah's lane. These are all perfectly clean ejections, too. No stovepipes, no failures to extract. Her gun handling was flawless. Marcus pulled out his phone and started searching the internet. I'm going to find out who she is. Nobody shoots like that without leaving some kind of record. What are you going to search for? Tony asked. We don't even know her last name. I'll start with local shooting competitions, maybe check some military databases I still have access to. Marcus was becoming obsessed with solving the mystery. His pride had taken a serious hit, and he needed answers. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, taking a moment to collect herself before driving home. She had hoped to practice quietly without drawing attention, but she should have known better. Her skills were too ingrained, too automatic to hide completely. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. The call was answered on the second ring. "Sarah, is everything okay?" The voice belonged to her former team leader, Colonel James Harrison, now retired. "I'm fine, Jim. I just had a situation at a shooting range. Nothing serious, but I may have revealed more than I intended." Harrison's voice became serious. "What kind of situation?" "Some local guys were giving me a hard time, making jokes about my abilities. I shut them down with my shooting, but now they're asking questions." "How bad was your shooting?" Sarah looked back at the range building. 10 rounds, 25 yards, golf ball-sized group. Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, that's not exactly staying under the radar." "I know. I just got tired of being treated like I didn't belong there." "I understand, but you know why it's important to keep a low profile. Your work with the unit was classified for good reasons." Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll be more careful. Maybe it's time you found a private range, or better yet, just do your practice out at my place. I've got that set up in my back 40 that nobody can see from the road." "That might be a good idea." Back inside the range, Marcus was showing Buck the photos of Sarah's target. Buck studied the image on the phone screen and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck said. "That's some serious shooting right there. Have you ever seen her before?" Marcus asked. Buck shook his head. "First time. But now I wish I'd paid more attention when she was filling out the paperwork." "What do you mean?" "I keep copies of all the forms for liability reasons. Let me check what she wrote down." Buck disappeared into the back office and returned with Sarah's paperwork. Marcus leaned over the counter as Buck spread out the form. Most of the information was standard: name, address, phone number, but Buck pointed to one particular line. "Look at this," Buck said. "Under previous firearms experience? Most people write things like hunting or took a class once. She wrote extensive." "That's pretty vague," Tony observed. "Yeah, but it's honest," Buck replied. "Most people either oversell their experience or undersell it. She just wrote one word that covers everything without giving anything away." Marcus studied the address on the form. "She lives about an hour from here. Question is, why drive all this way to practice? Maybe she wanted to go somewhere nobody would recognize her," Rick suggested. Buck nodded thoughtfully. "You know, now that I think about it, there was something different about how she handled that pistol. Most people, even experienced shooters, there's a little hesitation when they first pick up a rental gun. They need a moment to get familiar with it. And," Marcus prompted, "she handled it like it was her own weapon, like she'd been carrying that exact model for years." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Military personnel often carried Glock 19s, but so did a lot of other professionals. Police officers, federal agents, private security contractors, and certain special operations units all favored the reliable Austrian pistol. "I'm going to do some research when I get home," Marcus announced. "There's got to be something online about who she is." What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had spent 8 years as a member of an elite military unit that didn't officially exist. Her records were buried so deep in classified databases that even military investigators would have trouble finding them. She had trained at facilities that weren't on any map, and her operations had taken place in countries that the government would never acknowledge sending troops to. As Sarah drove home, she thought about her conversation with Colonel Harrison. Maybe it was time to stop trying to maintain a normal civilian life. The skills that had kept her alive in the world's most dangerous places weren't easily hidden, and incidents like today were bound to happen again. She had left the military life behind 3 years ago, hoping to find peace in anonymity. But peace, she was learning, might be harder to achieve than any mission she had ever completed. Marcus spent the entire evening hunched over his laptop, searching through every database he could access. His military connections gave him entry to several veterans' networks and shooting competition records. But every search for Sarah Martinez turned up dozens of results, none of which matched the quiet woman from the range. His wife, Jennifer, brought him a cup of coffee and looked over his shoulder at the screen. "Still obsessing over that woman from the shooting range? Jen, you should have seen what she did." "It was impossible. Nobody shoots like that without years of intensive training." Jennifer sighed and sat down beside him. Maybe she's just naturally talented. Some people are gifted at things. Natural talent doesn't explain muscle memory that precise. The way she handled that weapon, the way she stood, the way she breathed between shots. Everything was textbook perfect. But it wasn't just textbook, it was automatic. Marcus clicked through another page of search results, growing more frustrated by the minute. She didn't even aim for very long. Most competitive shooters take their time, really line up their shots. She just raised the gun and fired like she was pointing at something across the room. Maybe you should just let it go, Jennifer suggested gently. Does it really matter who she is? Marcus turned to face his wife. It matters because she made me feel like a complete amateur. I've been shooting since I was 12 years old. I qualified expert marksman in the Army. I thought I was pretty good until today. And now? Now I feel like I've been playing in the minor leagues my whole life, and she just showed me what the major leagues look like. 3 towns over, Sarah was having her own restless evening. She had tried to watch television, attempted to read a book, and even considered going for a run. But nothing could settle the anxiety that had been building since she left the range. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Harrison. Talked to some contacts. No unusual chatter about today. You're probably fine, but stay alert. Sarah appreciated Jim's concern, but she knew the real danger wasn't from enemy agents or foreign governments. The real danger was from her own inability to live a normal life. Every time she tried to blend in, something happened to remind her that she would never be just another civilian. She walked to her bedroom closet and moved aside several boxes of shoes to reveal a small safe built into the wall. Inside were items she hadn't touched in months: her service weapon, spare magazines, a tactical knife, and a small collection of medals and commendations that officially didn't exist. At the bottom of the safe was a photograph of her old team, 12 men and women who had become her family during their years of covert operations. Half of them were dead now, killed in missions that would never be acknowledged by their government. The other half had scattered to the wind, trying to build new lives just as she was. Sarah picked up the photo and studied the faces of her fallen teammates. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, who could defuse any bomb ever made. Lieutenant Kate Morrison, who spoke 7 languages fluently. Captain David Rodriguez, who had saved Sarah's life in Syria and paid for it with his own 3 months later. She put the photo back and closed the safe. Tomorrow she would call Jim and ask about using his private range. It was time to stop pretending she could be someone she wasn't. The next morning, Marcus returned to Eagle Eye Shooting Range with a new plan. He had printed out several photos from his internet searches and hoped Buck might recognize Sarah from one of them. Back again, Buck asked as Marcus approached the counter. I wanted to ask you something about yesterday. The woman, Sarah, did anything about her seem familiar? Buck raised an eyebrow. Familiar how? Marcus spread the printed photos across the counter. I found these pictures online from various shooting competitions and military events. Any chance she might be one of these people? Buck studied the photos carefully but shook his head. Nope, don't recognize her from any of these. But Marcus, why are you so fixated on this? Because what happened yesterday doesn't make sense. That level of shooting ability doesn't come from nowhere. Tony and Rick arrived at the range while Marcus was still talking to Buck. They had agreed to meet up for another practice session, though all 3 men were still thinking about the mysterious Sarah. Any luck with your detective work? Rick asked. Marcus gathered up his photos. Nothing. It's like she doesn't exist in any official shooting records. Maybe that's because she's not supposed to, Tony suggested quietly. Both Marcus and Rick turned to look at him. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Think about it. What kind of shooters have skills like that, but don't show up in competition records or military databases? Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he understood what Tony was implying. You're talking about Black Ops, special forces units that don't officially exist. I'm just saying, Tony continued. If someone wanted to disappear from the official record, there are ways to do it, especially if they had the right kind of government connections. Buck had been listening to the conversation with growing interest. You boys think she's some kind of secret agent? It would explain everything, Rick said. The shooting skills, the lack of records, the way she just vanished when we started asking questions. Marcus wasn't sure if he found this theory exciting or terrifying. If Sarah really was former special operations, then his attempt to embarrass her at the range took on a completely different meaning. He had essentially challenged a professional killer to a shooting contest. "We should probably drop this whole thing," Marcus said, though his curiosity was still burning. "Or," Tony said with a grin, "we could go back next weekend and see if she shows up again." Unknown to the three men, Sarah was at that moment driving toward Colonel Harrison's ranch 50 miles outside the city. She had called him early that morning and asked to use his private shooting facility, and Jim had immediately agreed. The ranch was hidden in a valley surrounded by hills, accessible only by a long dirt road that wound through thick forest. Sarah had been there many times during her military service, usually for emergency briefings or debriefings that couldn't take place on official bases. Jim Harrison was waiting for her when she arrived, looking exactly as she remembered him, tall, gray-haired, with the kind of quiet confidence that marked true leaders. He had commanded their unit for 6 years, and Sarah trusted him more than anyone else in the world. "Good to see you, Sarah," he said, giving her a brief hug, "though I wish it was under better circumstances. I'm sorry about yesterday. I should have been more careful." Jim waved away her apology. "Don't worry about it. We've all been there. The skills don't just disappear because we want them to." He led her around the ranch house to a shooting range that was far more sophisticated than anything at Eagle Eye. The targets could be set at distances up to 500 yards, and there were multiple lanes for different types of weapons training. "I had some time to think about your situation last night," Jim said as they walked. "Maybe it's time you stopped trying to hide who you are." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time you started teaching instead of hiding. There are plenty of civilians who could benefit from your skills, and it might give you a sense of purpose again." Teaching? Sarah had never considered the possibility. Private instruction, tactical training for law enforcement, even competition coaching. You could help people improve their abilities while staying engaged with what you do best. Sarah thought about Marcus and his friends at the range. Despite their initial mockery, she had seen genuine respect in their eyes after they witnessed her shooting. Maybe Jim was right. Maybe it was time to stop running from who she was and start embracing it. "It's worth considering," she admitted. Jim smiled. "Good. Now let's see if you're still as good as you used to be. I've got some new targets set up that should give you a real challenge." As Sarah unpacked her gear, she felt a familiar sense of calm settling over her. For the first time in months, she was exactly where she belonged. The following weekend, Marcus found himself back at Eagle Eye shooting range, checking his watch every few minutes. It was almost noon and there was still no sign of Sarah. Tony and Rick had arrived an hour earlier, and all three men were pretending to practice while actually watching the entrance. "She's not coming," Rick said, ejecting an empty magazine from his pistol. "Why would she? We probably scared her away with all our questions." Marcus loaded fresh rounds into his magazine with unnecessary force. "Maybe that's for the best. I've been thinking about what Tony said last week, and if she really is some kind of former special ops, we might not want to mess with her." "Come on, she seemed harmless enough," Tony argued. "A little mysterious, sure, but not dangerous." Buck overheard the conversation from behind the counter and chuckled. "You boys are still talking about that woman? She really got under your skin, didn't she?" "It's not about getting under our skin," Marcus protested. "It's about respect for skill. I've never seen shooting like that in person." "Well, you might get another chance," Buck said, nodding toward the entrance, "because she just walked in." All three men turned to see Sarah entering the range. She wore the same casual clothing as before, jeans, sneakers, and a simple hoodie. But something about her demeanor was different. She seemed more relaxed, more confident, like she had made peace with something. "Good afternoon," she said to Buck as she approached the counter. "Welcome back," Buck replied with genuine warmth. "Same setup as last time?" "Actually, I was wondering if you had anything more challenging available. Maybe longer distance targets?" Buck's eyebrows rose. "We can set you up at 50 yards if you want. That's about as far as our range goes. 50 yards would be perfect." As Buck prepared her paperwork, Sarah glanced over at Marcus and his friends. They were obviously watching her, but trying to pretend they weren't. She made a decision that surprised even herself. "Excuse me," she said, walking over to their lane. "You're Marcus, right?" Marcus nearly dropped his pistol. Yeah. That's me. I owe you an apology for last week. You were just being friendly and I was unnecessarily standoffish." Tony and Rick exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had expected. No apology needed, Marcus said quickly. We were being pretty obnoxious, actually. Questioning your abilities before we even saw you shoot? Sarah smiled slightly. Well, you weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. Most people don't expect someone who looks like me to have extensive firearms training. About that, Rick interjected. We've been wondering, and I hope you don't mind us asking, but where did you learn to shoot like that? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her response. Colonel Harrison's words from the previous weekend echoed in her mind. Maybe it was time to stop hiding who she was. I served in the military for 8 years, she said finally. Specialized training. What branch? Marcus asked, his interest clearly piqued. Army. But I can't really talk about the specific unit or what we did. Most of it's still classified. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. His suspicions had been correct, but hearing it confirmed made it somehow more real and more intimidating. Special Forces? Tony asked quietly. Sarah nodded. Something like that. The conversation was interrupted by Buck calling Sarah's name. Her lane was ready and her rental weapon was waiting. She excused herself and walked back to collect her gear, leaving the 3 men in stunned silence. Holy shit, Rick whispered. She actually told us. Special Forces, Marcus repeated, shaking his head. No wonder she shoots like that. Sarah set up at lane 8, which Buck had configured for 50-yard shooting. The target looked impossibly small at that distance, but she felt a familiar sense of calm as she loaded her magazine and took her position. From 2 lanes away, Marcus and his friends watched as Sarah began her shooting routine. Even at the increased distance, her stance was perfect, her breathing controlled, and her shots came in the same steady rhythm they remembered from the previous week. When she brought back her target, all 4 men gathered around to look at the results. At 50 yards, Sarah had placed all 10 shots in a group smaller than a tennis ball, centered in the high-scoring zone. That's inhuman, Tony breathed. That's training, Sarah corrected. Years and years of very intensive training. Marcus stared at the target, then back at Sarah. Can I ask you something? What was it like? Being in Special Forces, I mean. Sarah's expression grew serious. It was the most important thing I've ever done and the hardest thing I've ever done. We saved lives, but we lost friends. We stopped bad things from happening, but we had to do things that most people couldn't live with. Do you miss it? Rick asked. Every day, Sarah admitted. But I also know it was time to leave. There's only so long you can live that life before it starts living you. Marcus felt a deep respect growing for this woman, who had just shared something obviously personal and difficult. What do you do now? I'm still figuring that out, Sarah said. I've been trying to live a normal civilian life, but as you saw last week, that's easier said than done. Buck had been listening to the conversation from nearby, and he stepped forward with an idea. You know, Sarah, we get a lot of people in here who could use some professional instruction. Law enforcement, security guards, even regular folks who want to improve their home defense skills. Sarah looked at him with interest. You're suggesting I teach? Why not? You've obviously got the skills, and there's definitely a market for high-level firearms instruction around here. Marcus suddenly spoke up. I'd be your first student. Sarah turned to him in surprise. Really? After what I've seen you do, absolutely. I thought I was a decent shot, but you've shown me there's a whole other level I didn't even know existed. Tony and Rick nodded their agreement. Count us in too, Tony said. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of purpose, of being needed for her skills rather than having to hide them. I'd have to think about it. Teaching is very different from doing. Maybe you could start small, Buck suggested. Just a few private lessons, see how it goes. I could provide the space and equipment, and we could split the fees. What would you want to learn? Sarah asked Marcus. Everything, he said immediately. Precision shooting, tactical movement, weapon handling, whatever you're willing to teach. Sarah looked around the range, imagining herself as an instructor rather than someone trying to hide her abilities. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Let me think about it over the week, she said finally. I'll give you an answer next weekend. As Sarah packed up her gear, she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since leaving the military, she could see a path forward that didn't require her to pretend to be someone else. Marcus watched her leave, already planning what he would want to learn in their first lesson. He had started the previous weekend trying to embarrass a stranger, and now he was hoping to become her student. Life, he reflected, had a funny way of teaching lessons when you least expected them. Buck was already thinking about the business possibilities. Professional firearms instruction was expensive, and if Sarah was as good a teacher as she was a shooter, they could both make good money while helping people improve their skills. As Sarah drove home, she pulled out her phone and called Colonel Harrison. "Jim, it's Sarah. I think I'm ready to stop hiding." "What changed your mind?" he asked. "I met some people who reminded me that there's nothing wrong with being good at something. Maybe it's time I started helping others be good at it too." Harrison smiled on the other end of the line. "I think that's the best decision you've made since leaving the service." Sarah felt a familiar sense of mission forming in her mind. It wasn't the same as her military operations, but it was purpose nonetheless, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. The week passed slowly for Marcus, who found himself thinking constantly about the possibility of training with Sarah. He had done some research on Special Forces training methods and realized how much he didn't know about proper shooting techniques. His Army training had been thorough, but it was designed for basic combat situations, not the precision work that Sarah had demonstrated. On Wednesday evening, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Marcus?" "This is Sarah Martinez." From the shooting range, Marcus nearly dropped his phone. "Sarah, hi. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until the weekend. I've been thinking about your offer to be a student, and I wanted to discuss some details before we meet again." "Of course. What would you like to know?" "First, I need you to understand that if we do this, it's going to be completely different from anything you've experienced before. Military training is designed to create specific responses under extreme stress. Are you prepared for that kind of intensity?" Marcus hesitated. He had imagined learning some advanced shooting techniques, but Sarah was talking about something much more serious. "What exactly would the training involve?" "Everything starts with mindset," Sarah explained. "The way you think about the weapon, the way you think about accuracy, the way you think about yourself as a shooter. Most civilian training focuses on the mechanics: stance, grip, sight alignment. That's important, but it's only about 20% of what makes someone truly proficient. What's the other 80%? Mental discipline, emotional control, the ability to perform under pressure. Anyone can hit a target when they're calm and relaxed. The real test is hitting it when your heart is racing, when you're tired, when everything is going wrong." Marcus felt a chill of excitement mixed with apprehension. "That sounds intense." "It is. And I need to know that you're serious about learning, not just curious about what I can do, because once we start, I'm going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed before." Marcus thought about his military service, the physical training, the combat exercises, the deployment stress. "I think I can handle it." "Think isn't good enough. You need to know. Because if you quit halfway through, it doesn't just waste your time and mine. It means you'll leave with incomplete training, which can be dangerous." The seriousness in Sarah's voice made Marcus reconsider everything. This wasn't going to be a few friendly lessons at the range. This was going to be real training, the kind that changed people. "I'm in," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." "Good. We'll start Saturday morning at 6 a.m., not at Eagle Eye. I'll text you an address. Bring water, wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty, and prepare to unlearn everything you think you know about shooting." After Sarah hung up, Marcus sat in his living room staring at his phone. His wife Jennifer came downstairs and found him looking pale. "Everything okay?" she asked, sitting beside him on the couch. "That was Sarah, the woman from the shooting range. She's agreed to train me." "That's what you wanted, right?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I don't think I understood what I was asking for." "She's not talking about teaching me to shoot better. She's talking about something much more serious." Jennifer studied her husband's expression. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I need to do this. I've been coasting on my basic military training for years, thinking I was good enough. But after seeing what real skill looks like, I can't go back to pretending." The next morning, Tony called Marcus at work. "Hey man, did you hear anything from that Sarah woman about the training?" "Actually, yeah. She called last night. We're starting Saturday, as in all of us." Marcus paused. Sarah had only mentioned him in their conversation. "I think she wants to start with just me. Maybe if it goes well, she'll consider taking on more students." Tony was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense, I guess. Start small, see how it works out. Are you disappointed?" "A little," Tony admitted, "but also relieved. If she's as intense as she seems, I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of commitment." Saturday morning arrived gray and cold. Marcus drove to the address Sarah had texted him, which turned out to be Colonel Harrison's ranch. He didn't know who owned the property, but as he drove up the long dirt road, he realized this was a serious training facility, not just someone's backyard range. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived, dressed in military-style clothing and looking more like a soldier than she ever had at Eagle Eye. Beside her stood an older man with gray hair and the bearing of a career military officer. "Marcus, this is Jim Harrison," Sarah said as he got out of his car. "He's going to be observing your training to make sure I don't kill you on the first day." Harrison extended his hand with a slight smile. "Colonel Harrison retired. I used to be Sarah's commanding officer." Marcus shook hands, feeling increasingly out of his depth. "Nice to meet you, sir. Just Jim is fine. We're all civilians here now." Sarah led Marcus to a shooting range that was far more sophisticated than anything he had ever seen. There were multiple target systems, electronic scoring devices, and what looked like a small obstacle course adjacent to the firing line. "Before we touch a single weapon," Sarah said, "we're going to talk about what you think you know versus what you actually know." She handed Marcus an empty pistol, the same model, Glock 19 she had used at Eagle Eye. "Show me your stance." Marcus positioned himself the way he had been taught in the Army, feet shoulder-width apart, strong side foot slightly back. Isosceles grip on the weapon. "Good foundation," Sarah said. "Now show me how you acquire a target." Marcus raised the pistol and lined up the sights on a target 25 yards away. "What are you thinking about right now?" Sarah asked. "Front sight focus, trigger control, breathing. All correct but incomplete. You're thinking about the mechanics of the shot. But you're not thinking about the purpose of the shot." Marcus lowered the weapon and looked at her questioningly. "Every shot has a purpose," Sarah explained. "In the military, we don't shoot targets for points or for fun. We shoot to neutralize threats, to protect teammates, to accomplish missions. The mindset behind the shot is just as important as the technique." Harrison nodded from his position nearby. Sarah's team had a saying, "Shoot with purpose, not with hope." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked. "It means you don't pull the trigger hoping the bullet will hit where you want it to," Sarah said. "You pull the trigger knowing exactly where it's going to hit and why it needs to hit there." Sarah took the pistol from Marcus and demonstrated. She raised it smoothly, acquired the target, and fired a single shot. The electronic scoring system immediately displayed the result, a perfect bullseye. "I didn't hope that bullet would hit the center," she said. "I knew it would hit the center because I made every part of my body work together to put it there. That's the difference between shooting and fighting." Marcus felt a new understanding beginning to form. "You're teaching me to fight, not just to shoot. I'm teaching you to think like someone whose life depends on their accuracy. Because once you develop that mindset, the physical skills become much easier to learn." Over the next hour, Sarah broke down every aspect of Marcus's shooting technique and rebuilt it from the ground up. His stance, his grip, his breathing, his trigger finger placement, everything was analyzed and corrected with military precision. But more than the physical corrections, Sarah was changing the way Marcus thought about each shot. Instead of just trying to hit the target, she taught him to visualize the exact point of impact before he pulled the trigger. Instead of just controlling his breathing, she taught him to use his breathing to enhance his focus and calm his nervous system. "The weapon is just a tool," Sarah explained as Marcus practiced the new techniques. "The real weapon is your mind. Everything else is just an extension of your mental state." By the end of the session, Marcus was exhausted in ways he hadn't expected. His muscles were tired from maintaining perfect form for hours. But his mind was even more drained from the intense concentration required. "How do you feel?" Harrison asked as they packed up the equipment. "Like I've been doing everything wrong for the past 20 years, Marcus admitted. Sarah smiled. "That's normal. Everyone feels that way after their first real training session. When do we do this again?" "Next Saturday, same time. But this week I want you to practice the dry fire exercises I showed you. 15 minutes every day focusing on trigger control and sight alignment." As Marcus drove home, he realized that Sarah had been right about one thing. This was going to change him. He could feel it already. A new awareness of precision, of purpose, of what it meant to truly master a skill. For the first time since leaving the Army, he felt like he was learning something that mattered. 3 weeks into his training with Sarah, Marcus was a different shooter than he had been at Eagle Eye. The changes went beyond just better accuracy, though his groups had tightened considerably. Sarah had rebuilt his entire approach to firearms, turning shooting from a recreational activity into a discipline that required constant mental engagement. On this particular Saturday, Sarah had something new planned for him. "Today we're going to work on shooting under stress," she announced as Marcus arrived at the ranch. Colonel Harrison was there again, but this time he had brought additional equipment, what looked like a timing system and several props that Marcus didn't recognize. "Stress?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to learn that questioning Sarah's methods was usually pointless. "Everything we've practiced so far has been under ideal conditions," Sarah explained. "Perfect lighting, no time pressure, no physical stress, no distractions. Real situations are never ideal." She led him to a modified version of the shooting range he was familiar with. The targets were the same, but now there were barriers, obstacles, and what appeared to be a course laid out with cones and markers. "You're going to start here," Sarah said, pointing to a line marked on the ground. "When I give the signal, you'll run to the first barrier, engage 3 targets, move to the second position, engage 2 more targets, then return here. All shots must be in the scoring zone, and you have 90 seconds to complete the entire course." Marcus looked at the course layout and felt his heart rate increase just thinking about it. 90 seconds? That seems impossible. For most people it is, but you're not most people anymore. "You've been training for this." Harrison held up the timer. "This is how we used to test Sarah's team. The physical stress simulates combat conditions, and the time pressure forces you to apply your training instinctively instead of thinking through each shot." Marcus loaded his magazine and positioned himself at the starting line. His hands were already sweating and he hadn't even begun the course yet. "Remember," Sarah said, "everything we've practiced still applies. Proper stance, controlled breathing, smooth trigger pull. The only difference is that you're going to do it while your body is under stress." "Ready?" Harrison called out, his finger hovering over the timer. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Go!" Marcus sprinted toward the first barrier, his gear bouncing as he ran. When he reached the firing position, he was already breathing hard and his heart was pounding. He raised his weapon and tried to apply everything Sarah had taught him, but his first shot missed the target completely. "Breathe," Sarah shouted from behind him. "Control your heart rate." Marcus forced himself to slow down, took a deep breath, and fired again. This shot hit the target, but outside the scoring zone. His third shot was better, and his fourth finally hit where it was supposed to. He moved to the second position, his legs already feeling heavy from the sprint. The next 2 targets seemed impossibly far away, and his arms felt shaky as he raised the weapon. 50 seconds left. Harrison called out, panic set in. Marcus rushed his shots, missing 1 target entirely and barely clipping the other. By the time he returned to the starting line, he was completely exhausted and deeply frustrated. "Time," Harrison announced. 2 minutes, 47 seconds. Marcus bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "That was horrible." "That was your first attempt," Sarah corrected. "And it was better than most people do on their 10th attempt." "I missed half my shots." "Yes, you did." "Do you know why?" Marcus thought about the course, trying to analyze what had gone wrong. "I panicked. I let the time pressure get to me." "Partially correct. You let your emotional state override your training. Under stress, most people revert to their worst habits instead of their best training." Sarah had Marcus run the course 5 more times that morning. Each attempt was slightly better than the last, but he was nowhere near the 90-second target. By the end of the session, he was physically and mentally drained. "I don't think I'm cut out for this level of training," Marcus said as they cleaned their weapons. "That's exactly what I said after my first stress course," Sarah replied. "I was so frustrated I almost quit." Marcus looked at her in surprise. "Really? Really? I had been the best shooter in my basic training class, qualified expert on every weapon the Army had. Then I got to special operations training and couldn't hit the broadside of a barn when they added stress to the equation. What changed? I learned that physical skills are only half the battle. The other half is mental resilience, the ability to maintain your training when everything is going wrong." Harrison, who had been listening to the conversation, added his perspective. Sarah's team operated in situations where missing a shot could mean the difference between mission success and total failure. There was no room for panic or hesitation. "How long did it take you to master the stress courses?" Marcus asked. Months, Sarah admitted. And even then I was constantly working to improve. This kind of training isn't something you complete, it's something you maintain. As they walked back toward the parking area, Sarah made a proposal that surprised Marcus. I've been thinking about expanding the training program. What you experienced today is just the beginning of what we could offer. What do you mean? Law enforcement agencies, security companies, even military units sometimes need specialized training that they can't get through official channels. There's a real market for this kind of instruction. Marcus was intrigued. You're talking about starting a business? More than that. I'm talking about creating a place where people can learn skills that might save their lives someday. Real skills, not just weekend warrior stuff. Harrison nodded his approval. Sarah's been discussing this with me for the past week. I think it's an excellent idea. What would you need to make it happen? Marcus asked. Students, for one thing. People who are serious about learning and willing to commit to the kind of training we're doing. Marcus thought about Tony and Rick, who had been asking him weekly about his progress with Sarah. I know at least 2 other people who would be interested. I'd also need to develop a curriculum, get proper insurance, maybe find a permanent facility. What about here? Marcus gestured toward the ranch. Harrison answered. I've already told Sarah she can use this place as much as she needs. I've got more space than I know what to do with, and it would be good to see it being used for training again. Sarah looked around the property with new eyes. It would need some modifications, but it could work. So what's the next step? Marcus asked. Keep training, Sarah said simply. You're my proof of concept. If I can turn you into the kind of shooter who can handle stress courses, then I can teach anyone. Marcus felt a mixture of pressure and pride. No pressure there. Actually, there's a lot of pressure. Because in 2 weeks I want you to run that course again, and this time I want you to make the time limit. As Marcus drove home, he thought about everything that had happened since that first day at Eagle Eye. He had started as someone who thought he was a decent shooter, become someone who realized he didn't know anything, and was now apparently going to be part of something much larger than just personal improvement. His phone buzzed with a text from Tony. How was training today? Marcus typed back, brutal and amazing. Call you tonight. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he was part of something important again, something that mattered beyond just hitting targets on a range. 6 months later, the Harrison Ranch Training Facility was hosting its first official class for law enforcement officers from 3 different counties. Marcus stood beside Sarah as she addressed the 12 officers who had signed up for the intensive weekend course. Before we begin, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of leading soldiers in combat, I want you to understand that everything you're going to learn here has been tested in real-world situations where failure meant death. The officers, who had arrived with the casual confidence of people accustomed to carrying weapons professionally, grew more attentive as Sarah continued. My name is Sarah Martinez. I spent 8 years in Army Special Operations, and the techniques we're going to practice are the same ones that kept my team alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Marcus watched the faces of the officers as they processed this information. He remembered his own reaction 6 months earlier, when Sarah had first revealed her background. The mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and respect was familiar. Sergeant Williams from County Metro has graciously agreed to demonstrate our first exercise, Sarah announced. Williams, a burly man in his 40s who clearly considered himself an expert marksman, stepped forward with confidence. Sarah led him to the stress course that Marcus now knew intimately. Simple exercise, Sarah explained to the group. Sergeant Williams will engage 5 targets while moving through the course. All shots must be in the scoring zone, and he has 90 seconds to complete it. Williams looked at the course layout and shrugged. Seems straightforward enough. Marcus exchanged a knowing look with Tony and Rick, who had joined the program 3 months earlier, and were now serving as assistant instructors. They had all learned the hard way that nothing about Sarah's training was straightforward. Whenever you're ready, Sergeant, Sarah said, activating the timer. Williams began the course with the same overconfidence that Marcus had shown months earlier. He sprinted to the first position, raised his weapon, and fired rapidly at the targets. His shots were scattered across the target faces, with only 2 hitting the scoring zones. As Williams moved through the course, his performance deteriorated rapidly. The physical stress of running between positions while carrying gear caused his heart rate to spike, and his shooting accuracy fell apart completely. By the time he finished, he had missed more targets than he had hit. "Time," Colonel Harrison called out. 3 minutes, 22 seconds. Williams stood at the finish line, breathing heavily and staring at his target results in disbelief. "That's not possible. I'm a firearms instructor for my department." "And you're very good at what you do," Sarah said without condescension. "But what you've been training for and what we're training for are two different things." She gathered the group around Williams's targets. "Sergeant Williams has excellent marksmanship skills when shooting from a stable position with no time pressure. But real confrontations don't happen under ideal conditions." Officer Janet Morrison from the Sheriff's Department raised her hand. "What's the purpose of this exercise?" "We're not soldiers running assault courses." Sarah nodded, appreciating the question. "You're right. You're not soldiers, but you do face situations where you might need to shoot accurately while under extreme stress. Domestic violence calls that turn violent, active shooter situations. Traffic stops that go bad. Your training needs to prepare you for when everything goes wrong." Marcus stepped forward. 6 months ago, I was exactly where Sergeant Williams is right now. I thought I was a good shooter because I could hit targets at the range. But Sarah taught me that there's a difference between shooting and being able to shoot when it matters. "Show them," Sarah said simply. Marcus moved to the starting line of the stress course. The officers watched as he loaded his weapon and positioned himself. When Sarah started the timer, Marcus moved through the course with fluid efficiency. His shots were precise and controlled even while moving at speed. He completed the entire course in 87 seconds with all targets hit in the scoring zones. The officers stared in amazement. Williams shook his head slowly. 6 months ago you couldn't do that?" 6 months ago I couldn't even come close," Marcus admitted. "My first attempt took almost 3 minutes and I missed half my shots." Officer Morrison looked from Marcus to Sarah. "What exactly did you teach him?" "I taught him that shooting is 10% physical technique and 90% mental discipline," Sarah replied. "Everything else flows from that understanding." Over the next 2 days, Sarah put the officers through a comprehensive program that challenged everything they thought they knew about firearms training. She taught them breathing techniques that could lower heart rate under stress, visualization methods that improved accuracy, and movement patterns that maximized cover while maintaining shooting stability. But more than the technical skills, Sarah was teaching them a new mindset about their profession. She helped them understand that carrying a weapon was about more than just having the ability to use it. It was about having the mental preparation to use it effectively when lives were at stake. "In my old unit, we had a saying," Sarah told the group during their final session. "We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Your training needs to be harder than anything you'll face in the real world." Sergeant Williams, who had struggled with every exercise for 2 days, raised his hand. "Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, why are you doing this? I mean, why leave special operations to teach cops how to shoot?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out over the training facility that had become her new mission. "Because the skills I learned in the military shouldn't die with me. If I can help one officer go home safely to their family, then everything I went through was worth it." Officer Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "How do we continue this training? 2 days isn't enough to really master what you're teaching. That's why we're starting monthly advanced courses," Marcus announced, "for officers who want to continue developing these skills." Colonel Harrison stepped forward. "We're also working with the State Police Academy to incorporate some of these techniques into their standard training curriculum." As the weekend concluded, the officers lined up to thank Sarah personally. Their attitudes had completely changed, from the skeptical professionals who had arrived on Friday to committed students who understood they had just learned something that could save their. Therese Williams was the last to approach Sarah. "I owe you an apology. I came here thinking this was going to be some kind of military fantasy camp. I had no idea how much I didn't know." "That's the first step toward real learning," Sarah replied. "Admitting that you don't know everything. Will you take me on as a regular student?" "I want to learn everything you're willing to teach," Sarah smiled. "Report here next Saturday at 6 a.m. Bring water and wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty." As the officers departed, Marcus stood with Sarah and Harrison watching the cars disappear down the ranch road. "You know," Marcus said, 6 months ago none of us could have imagined this." 6 months ago? "I was a woman hiding from her past," Sarah replied. "Now I'm someone building a future with it." Harrison put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. Your team would be proud of what you're doing here. Sarah looked around the facility. The shooting ranges, the training courses, the classroom building they had recently constructed. Marcus had quit his job to become a full-time instructor. Tony and Rick were developing new curriculum for civilian concealed carry classes. The local police departments were sending their officers for regular training. But more than the physical expansion, Sarah had found something she didn't know she was looking for. She had found a way to honor her fallen teammates by ensuring their knowledge and skills lived on in others. She had found a way to use her abilities to protect people without having to kill anyone. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the best way to move forward wasn't to leave your past behind, but to find a new purpose for it. What's next? Marcus asked. Sarah watched the sun set over the hills surrounding the ranch. Next week, we start training the first class of civilian instructors. The goal is to create a network of qualified teachers who can spread this training nationwide. Think it will work? I think, Sarah said, that there are a lot of people out there who need to learn that being good at something isn't enough. You have to be good at it when it matters most. As they walked back toward the main building, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. She was still a warrior, but now she was fighting a different kind of battle, one that saved lives by preparing people for the moments when training became survival. The woman who had been mocked at a shooting range 6 months earlier was now running one of the most respected tactical training facilities in the region. But more than that, she had found peace with who she was and what she was capable of becoming. And for Sarah Martinez, that was worth more than any mission she had ever completed.